Hey everyone, how's it going? I hope you guys are doing well. I'm always a little tenuous at the beginning of these things because I'm not entirely sure when it's going to start actually streaming. Let's have a little look. Trying to get this going. So let me know if you guys can see me or. Oh, there we go. There we go. So, how are you guys doing? Thank you so much for coming and joining. It looks like there's 12 of us so far. Yeah, I'm really glad that you guys are here. I have loved getting to kind of sit down and see everything that you guys are doing. I love sort of listening to the stories about the things that you're learning while you're painting, and the things that are like really difficult and the things that are coming easy. But I really love it. So while we're here doing this live stream, I want you guys to feel free to ask questions. Feel free to just share and communicate the kinds of things that are going on. I'll be watching. I've got a little version of me right here. So, yeah, I can see you. I can see what you're saying. So let's get started. I'm going to put some paint on. And we're going to have a look through everyone who is doing the full feedback. Unfortunately, I couldn't do this for all of you guys. But hopefully, I genuinely think that instead of having 15 or 16 of you do this, we're basically kind of covering the gamut of sort of probably what just about everyone's experiencing. So. And I think, let me see, I've broken it down into a couple of different things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big categories of things that we need to be wary of, or at least things to discuss tonight. And yeah, so in a second we'll start to have a look through. Do feel free to say hi and chat. It's definitely easy when I can talk to you guys. Gonna make sure I have my coffee because it's late, or at least it's late for me because I have little kids and they wake up early no matter what. All right, can you guys hear me? See me? Is everything good? Otherwise, I'll just go for it. So let's have a look at where we were, where we are. I'm going to try and find, maybe it's this one here. There we go. All right. So I'm kind of going to go by category of things to be watchful of, become aware of, category of things that we need to be starting to learn. And I just want to say, sort of, first of all, this is a very non-judgmental area, non-judgmental zone. I respect all of you guys. You're really putting in a lot of hard work, and I think everyone else does too. We're sort of all in the same boat here. So if I say something, needs some work, I say that with love and respect. And honestly, no, I don't look down on anyone for where we are at, because we all come in here in a different part of our journey. So. Okay, we're going to start with the idea of kind of just mixing enough paint. Mixing enough paint. And this is something that's kind of cropped up in a number of different pieces. We're going to start here with Eris, and forgive me if I kind of mess up your names. I'm probably going to slaughter some names here. I'm going to grab my little towel. I promise I do wash them from time to time. But this thing is like indefinitely stained. So, and I think I probably don't need to belabor this point too much of mixing too much paint, because you guys have become aware of it pretty quick from what I've read. But yeah, so there's this idea of in trying to make consistent paint, we're coming in and we're mixing up our paint and putting it down. And then when we realize we don't have enough paint to actually cover the space that we're trying to cover in a thick, flat, consistent manner, then we sort of do it, and then we go back and we mix again, and we come back in, and that's always a bit of a risky idea. The idea of sort of coming back and trying to mix it again and bring it forward, especially when you're kind of just starting out and you're trying to get your feet, you're trying to figure out sort of exactly how even to mix paints to begin with. The little piece of advice I'm going to give is, if we're sitting here trying to mix some paint that is, well, I really don't see anyone chatting. Could someone chat just so I know that you're there, so that I know that I'm actually seeing everything that's going on? I'll try and come in here and see if my... everyone's here. All right, I don't know why I'm not picking up on my phone, so I'm gonna throw my phone. Okay, we're not doing that chit chat. Oh, you guys are the best. Okay, there you go. I can see everyone. Oh my gosh, so many people. Danae, Melissa, Amber, Ginny Chinchilla, Potter Freak, Zakay, Mallory, Bree, Kate. So good to see you guys. I'm glad you're here. All right, now we got that over with. I need to see what I'm showing. There we go. And I need that down there. So cool. Oh, so Kay says, I wasn't able to see it at first, but if you swap live chat for chop chat on mobile, it'll show the chats. All right, I'm gonna do that because it would be so much better to have this. There we go. Thank you for that. Okay, yeah, that's so much better. Good, now I can go back to my setup. So, if you're mixing, right? If you're mixing, and especially if you're kind of new to the game and trying to figure out this paint mixing thing, again, there's no pressure to get it perfect, but if you're gonna get something, and you're trying to make, and if you're trying to get something right, and you're trying to make a consistent piece of paint, the thing to get right is our values, so the light and dark quality. Because value describes kind of the movement of form and the movement of light. And if we are mixing our paint, actually color changes, like hue changes, they don't matter so much. They're something that we can play with and have fun with. And they are a really nice descriptor, but they're not all that important. Oh, I was freaking out there for a sec. Okay. You know what? I think I'm just going to stick with watching this on YouTube. You know what? I think I'm just... Oh, boom. Yeah, we're not going to have that record. All right. So there we go. Because my phone is messing things up. All right. Technical difficulties out of the way. So... yeah, so that's sort of one suggestion for how we approach when we've sort of found ourselves in a position of not having enough paint, and that happens all the time. And you need to mix again. Try to get those values right, because the color can change a little bit and it doesn't have as much of a functional impact. And so Aris, as I'm looking at this, and I can see that we've started off in here, especially with this background, and this is true of a lot of people's backgrounds, just for the fact that is a really big wide open space. And I chose this piece because it has those really big ones, and that's kind of here to belabor some of our weakness, and that's okay. It's more just like figuring out how things work. So yeah, so we have this background, and where it's changing values a bit. So you can see up here, we've got some darker space. Down here, some lighter space, and some dark and some light. And I want to say this is really well done. So I'm not. Anyway, I'll stop making excuses for myself. Yeah, so this is really cool. And we'll find this idea in a number of different pieces. So the second thing that I want to talk about, I'm just kind of going to go through this mixing enough paint idea as a whole. The second thing is when our second layer is kind of not thick enough, or it's a little too transparent to cover the first layer. So that's something that happens. Let's have a look. We're going to look at here. Breathe. There we go. Aha. Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to actually find out where I saw all of these things. So I actually saw this in a lot of people's works here in the dark side of the orange. And I know I probably had an impact on that because I painted it first and then you guys were following along and then I sort of went down again. But let's have a look at the other one, see if, here we go, Danae. Oh, here it is where it is. So Bree, with these leaves that are coming across, and we did the first layer of leaves, and then we came back in and put this second layer on. Let's zoom in nice and good. And so what we're seeing is kind of having that first layer down, which is really nice, and then having that extra, I think that the light layer was the extra layer on top, right? But unfortunately, we didn't quite have enough paint to cover over what was happening underneath. And so actually this happened 3 ways. So we've got the full background, and then this first darker layer, and then the second layer. And so at least in this idea, and tonight we're really talking about trying to get consistent paint. So that's really that's what we're focusing on. And yeah, so we've kind of got these things where you start to see through that transparent layer. And then we've got, here we go. So yeah, tonight I'm trying to do it by topic, and so it's going to be a bit of jumping around. Instead of previously, I've kind of done it by going through every person and going through everything. But I think this might be a more cohesive way because we're just talking about the same thing in a variety of contexts. So I think that'll be helpful. Yeah, so here's what I was talking about with the orange on the underside, the dark side of the orange. Kind of having, this is from Danae, having put that kind of first layer down and the second layer on top. And I think the second layer is darker than the first layer. And then you start to be able to see that second layer underneath, or over the top, but you can see the first layer underneath. And so this gets in the way of sort of having that consistent body. And so I'm just going to mention it here now briefly, but we will be talking about this a lot more in our layering class, because layering's not always easy. You kind of, activate and reactivate things. We're going to go into depth with that later, so I'm not going to push it for here and now. Man, I think all my stuff stops pulling in the chat. I don't know why. Yes, there it is. There we go. Yes, exactly what happened, says Bree. Also too much water. Yeah, I fully relate to having too much water. Trying to find that consistency, that right consistency, what we're going for is really what we're after. And it's difficult. And I think a little bit later we'll talk about we had talked about sort of finding recipes for that, how much water versus how much paint, and it's not quite that simple, but we're gonna do a little test later on to try and get that. Potter says, we're just quiet, taking it in. Fantastic. I will not worry too much about it then. Okay, so that was Bree and Danae. We're talking about having those layers and what gets in the way of that. A lot of the time it's a little too much water and being concerned about reactivating the stuff underneath, and we'll talk about that later. All right, so got more watered as we moved out. Yeah, so in the same vein of trying to mix enough paint, let's talk about one other problem that happens when we do that. So we're gonna go over to Nicole's piece. Here we go. Here we go. Am I sure that this is what we're going for? Yes, I am. There we go. Am I? I think we'll talk about that later. All right. Now let's talk about this water and paint mix. This is understandably a big deal. You know, when we're dealing with these things, it's like there's a certain degree of complexity, but most of our problems, most of our solutions come from really diving into some of these basic understandings. And so I just want to make sure you guys know when I say something that sounds really simple, I'm not expecting that we all sort of reach the full understanding of exactly what that means in application, because I don't even know exactly what there's always further to mine these ideas. And so when it comes back and I say, well, the answer is just this simple thing. Yeah, it's simple, but it's fundamental. Like it's really, it might be easy, but it's hard to strive for. So this idea of the water and paint mix, let's have a look. We're gonna go to Lindley, or shall I say my queen. Let's have a look. Coming on in here. Man, I think I've mislabeled some of these. All right, so no, actually, I know what I was talking about. We're gonna have a look at this. When we, so this is sort of the idea of not having quite enough paint, and again, sort of painting over the thing. So I think this happened with the edge of this vase, and even some down here, is when we're painting over somebody else, or when we're painting over something we've already painted, we kind of have to start stacking in kind of thicker and thicker paint, right? And so that's why sometimes if we're doing this, one way to do this, which is not the way we did do it, but if you're kind of exploring a painting, you can put down a really thin wash of everything. And the reason is that there's not that much paint to reactivate as we come back into it. And so then we can put sort of a slightly thicker wash coming in, and then sort of get a little more firm idea about what it is that we're after, and come in with an even thicker piece. And so when we're painting something like the side of this vase, and we want to come back in and put paint back over the top, we kind of have to be aware of what we've already put down. And that's gonna let us actually cover the stuff that we've done properly. Another idea that we could do, and we'll talk about this in some wet and wet stuff, is you can actually remove paint before putting that second layer down. It's a little complex, so that's why we'll talk about it later. But yeah, really, really good stuff. So I actually really like this. I think you've gotten a lot of really nice, solid pieces of paint. This orange right here is like key. I know with mine, I had to do like layers and layers and layers to even get it to be really consistent and thick enough because of the transparency of the yellow. Oh, here we go, good. So KMNT says, yeah, I think I went from thick to thin in some of my layers, which was an issue. Yeah. And so for me, it's like if I want to put something down and I already have a really thick layer of paint there, and I know that I can't just get what I want, that's when I'll start to remove the paint and take it away. But generally, thin to thick is a really good way to work if we're thinking about layering things. And I know we're a bit responsive, we don't always sort of plan ahead, and that's fine. But yeah, I do want to say you did a really, really good job at a lot of these places, which you kind of really just went for that one layer. Even the stuff here that you went over the top of to get these patterns in, it's really beautifully done. So I'm gonna have a look here in the background, really subtle detail back here, and I'm gonna make a guess, right? So I can see, I hope you guys can see this. In this sort of first layer that went down, we can start to see, and I wouldn't normally say this is a problem in a normal painting, but as an exercise of trying to find consistency, I'm just going to pick on you. It looks like you used a relatively big brush here, and I can see kind of where a very dry layer of paint went over the top of this lighter paint, or perhaps it's vice versa, but I think it's this darker dry stuff went over the top. You can see in the background this texture. But yeah, I think what you've done here is really, really great. I can see here some of this also, some of the idea we were talking about before of having kind of like a thin layer on top of a thicker paint, and then suddenly you can start to see through in some of the transparency of it all. And it's really hard when you're doing these little small dots. It really is hard. I don't blame you at all for this happening. And again, that actually kind of adds to the texture. But I just want to make sure that I mention that as we go. So it's a matter of trying to just always, I'm always having to be aware of the thickness of my paint. I think I saw a question here. Era says, does anyone know the problem of your paint disappearing when you paint it on top of another color, especially if it's the same color, just a different value? Yep. I don't know about disappearing entirely, but it'll go patchy on me. And then Kimberly says, I find that happens with my black and white paints particularly. Run into the problem of your paint disappearing when you paint it on top of another color. Are you painting into something that's already wet? That'd be my first question. And how thick is the paint that you're putting on? Gotta have that coffee while we're waiting for an answer. So Kimberly says, I find that happens a lot with my black and white paints. If I'm interpreting right, and I could very well not be, definitely with those black and white paints. So a lot of our gouache is very mid-tone. It's very mid-value, right in the middle. And you kind of get some lighter and some darker, so you kind of have this kind of stray pattern that kind of comes across here in terms of the value of all of the paints that you're using. And then you have white all the way up the top, and then you have black all the way to the bottom. There's a really huge gap in between white and black and most of the other paints that we're using. You get some like blues that are close to the black, but anytime we're working with white and black and we mix something else in or possibly on top of that, this transition mixing between these two things happens really quickly. And so we move in value so quick. And you kind of feel like you lose a lot of that what you were going for. When we're dealing with these mid-tone values, if I'm mixing a paint that's here and a paint that's here in value, one is a little bit darker, one's a little bit lighter, then your ratio is a very small, smooth transition between the two. So it's like you feel like you have this fine motor control between the values that you're using, compared especially to these white and black that are so far outlying. And the movement you get as you put just like a little bit of color into the white is like it shifts immensely. And you kind of start to lose a bit of stuff like that. So I'm wondering if that's what you're talking about. Okay, let's have a look. Potter Freak says, yeah, I didn't realize my brush was dry, but I decided to leave the background alone because I wanted to move on. Yeah, I totally get that. I would probably make a very similar decision in a regular painting. Era says, I remember waiting for it to dry before painting on top, but it might still be wet or damp. Yeah, it might be. Era says, the paint would look like it's drying very quickly and it disappears into the color beneath it. Oh, you know what you might be talking about is there's a value shift. So because I probably don't have time to go into and it doesn't really matter in practice, when these paints dry, they kind of fold into this mid-tone, which is sort of what we're talking about. A lot of paint is in that mid-tone. And so if I put something down that's kind of relatively light, as it dries, it gets darker. And so if I've already put a paint down and then I put something that's a little bit lighter on top of it, and then it starts to dry and the value shifts down. And maybe this is where you're talking, I think it probably is. And if you have these darks that are really dark, as it dries, the value shifts up. So everything kind of moves into this midtone, which is why a lot of people recommend with gouache, you kind of over-exaggerate the values you're going to use, and then they kind of come back in together to something a little more realistic looking and feeling. But totally, we're going to get to that as a complete subject in our values lesson. So I'm on board. Maybe they're too close in values. We'll talk more about this. I want to go on a rant, but I'm not going to because I will rant at you later. So let's get back to this for now. We're going to go to, yes, we're going to start talking about having not enough water. And it's a very easy mistake to make. And I want to show you the kinds of things we want to do to make sure that we have enough water. So let's go here, Amber Fire. Here we go. So, Amber, first of all, this is great. I see a lot of good consistency in here. And I think it would be even more consistent once you apply what we're about to talk about. And so I do believe you're more than capable of being very, very consistent. And a lot of your stuff you already have is. The one thing that's getting in the way is that you don't quite have enough water on your brush. So let's have a look at some of the telltale signs. Down here you can see these kind of textures as you're coming in and going. I'll say this again, and I'm probably going to say this way too many times. This is good in a painting. As this exercise, as the idea of trying to be aware of what our paint is doing, trying to be aware of the consistency of everything. This is just an area that we need to become more aware of. And I totally understand it. And so just kind of like what we're talking about the last painting, even here, we kind of have a couple of values, and you get these where you've painted one thing over another. And we're getting these little textures because you kind of have this dry brush moving over another. And that might be a little bit about the paper that we're using, which is, there's not a problem as well. But we can see it in this really big, it's honestly a very beautiful stroke. But it gets in the way of having a very consistent piece. So I think it's just a little bit more about being aware that if this is what we're going for, if we want something that's really consistent, we just need that little bit more water in what we're doing. And we will kind of go through a little bit of that later, those recipes we're after. Constantly just seeing in these textures. So what it's going to end up is that the edges of your strokes will have a little more texture to them. The different values of the different layers that you used. Yeah. So that's definitely something I want you to be a little more aware of. And if you have that control, then you can go back to doing this stuff and now have a wider capacity for the kind of strokes and the kinds of marks and the kinds of areas of paint that you want to use. So that's really good. Amber says, yeah, I noticed the paints were so much less frustrating in subsequent paints when I added more water with a pipette. Zakai says, I had the same problem a lot on mine. My spray bottle is my best friend. Yes, absolutely. So we're gonna now that I sort of explained that, let's go have a look at that in a couple of different paintings. Let's see, Kate. I'm glad to have you here. Let's see. Here we go. So I can start to see that in again in places like over here, and you can see all of these textures, places where we're mixing paints and we're coming to an intersection, and then you start to have have this play in the intersection that's not quite intended. Yeah. So I'm gonna say we didn't quite have enough. What is it? Yeah, it didn't quite have enough water. So the other thing, and at some points we had a little too much water. So there's a balance, and I think this is really just time and attention. Really, it's just attention. You very well have the capacity to overcome this by dialing in attention, and attention is something really hard to deal with, because we only have enough attention for one thing at a time, and I'm sort of structuring this course so that hopefully, if you put your attention on this thing now, on the consistency of everything, trying to make these really flat layers, put your attention on this, really try to get it. And then once we do that, once we start to get it, you no longer have to think about it. And then you can move on to the next thing that you can put your attention on and accumulate that ability. And so what we're really doing is we're kind of just getting these things. We cannot, possibly put our attention on everything all the time. That's just not the way that we work. So, we're going to put our attention on one thing at a time, sort of get that in, learn it, be aware of it, and then move on to the next thing that it enables us to do, and then become aware of it. And so the varying degrees of how much water is in your paint, I think, probably deserves a good bit of your attention. So let's get back to some communications. Coming from watercolor, I was so worried about overwatering my gouache that I went the other direction. I get that. Kate says, water consistency was tough. Yes. But yes, there's no but to that. Yes, it's tough. It pays off. It pays off. The more you can be aware of this, just like the easier absolutely everything from here on out gets. So it's worth your time. Let's go have a look at Nicole. Yes, so I can see here that we've got, again, kind of just varying degrees of water throughout. And once again, the idea of trying to get enough paint to begin with. And so this is something else that is a consequence of not quite having enough paint, not quite mixing enough paint. Is sort of in this area, you see this area, it's really nice and consistent. I can see sort of these extra paint marks that you put over, but I'm looking to what's underneath, and that's really nice. And we've sort of got that, and as we come across, it gets a little bit lighter. Now, it's only a little bit, so I'm not even worried about that. And so I think you started here, moved over this side, and then kind of got to this area over here. I want to make sure that it's in the screen. And now there's a lot less paint, probably on your palette, probably on your brush, a little more water. And yeah, so we end up with something that is, darker on one side and lighter on the other side. And again, it's probably not the best, not the worst thing in the world. But it's all about developing the eye for the varying degrees of consistency. Yeah. So just being aware of that. Let's have a look. I think I have, Lindley. Where are you, Lindley? McQueen? Did I start with this one? Yeah, sorry, I did. My bad. And Kate says, I think I was nervous about too much water. I understand that. Water is intimidating because you kind of lose control. You lose control. You kind of need a bit of that you really need to kind of go through the experience of having a lot of water and having a medium amount of water and having this, just knowing what's what. And it's chaos. It's chaos. This is the fun of it. And it's chaos. It's chaos. This is the fun of it. But it's also the hard part about it. So I get it. All right. So we also talked about how having not enough water creates sort of extra textures within the paint, especially when we're laying things. It also creates looser edges, which you can use to your benefit when we're not doing an exercise on consistency. So good stuff. So we talked about that. I think in the end we'll come back to this water paint. We'll sort of get some hands-on. Okay. Now loading. So loading is kind of what happens in your brush. And it's really connected to the idea of making sure you have enough paint, enough water, enough paint. But it's kind of the extra idea of you might actually have multiple colors in it. So I called it marbling in the lesson to some degree. Marbling is either between two colors or between the color and the water, where you sort of get inconsistent areas whilst picking up, which often results in inconsistent areas while putting down. So being aware of that. And you can also have kind of poly-loaded brush, which means we actually get different paints on the brush. Again, very nice technique, something we can use to our benefit. So we have a bad turtle here. I'm saying that because that's their name. I'm not calling them a bad turtle. Let's have a look at this. Yeah. Okay. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about, so we talked about sort of loading our brush. I don't know exactly why I wanted to talk about it with this piece. Oh yeah, up here. Let's zoom in. I want to say first, I want to make sure that I'm actually communicating this, which I probably haven't been doing a good job of. This is really good. I'm looking at like these really big consistent areas. We got some little spots of having heavier paint and having sort of less paint. So actually, this is a really good thing to talk about. We have this idea that we kind of always want to use the largest brush that we possibly can to do the thing that we're trying to do. I don't think I've mentioned that yet. And the reason is that if I use a small brush, the edges of the brush are going to move the paint in a slightly different way than the rest of the body. And so that's going to kind of mean that we end up running more risk of having lots of paint strokes. And yes, it's good to have paint strokes. We can use it to our effect. But general disclaimer is just it being really hard to put a lot of consistent paint down when we're using a small brush and we get lots of brush strokes. And so we tend to try and go for the largest brush possible to get this area. And I'm saying this here because as I'm looking down here and seeing this area, which is fighting against you, mostly probably because you used a small brush to try and do it. Ashley says, I had that problem with using my flat brush. Yeah. So yeah, we would help ourselves in this pursuit if we had a bigger brush. I probably should have mentioned that. Yeah. And see, there's lots of things to talk about. I want to make sure that I'm kind of going a little bit logically here. Okay, let's use this to jump off into the next topic, which is ghosting. Ghosting is not when you disappear from someone's life. Well, it is, but not in this case. In this case, it's more when. Oh, sorry. I want to make sure that I'm kind of like listening to this. Kimberly said, I got so frustrated with this piece trying to get a good consistency, I overwork my paint a lot. And she says, yeah, I tend to use a lot of small brushes. I need to expand my range. Yeah, so definitely it's that catch-22 of I want to make this really consistent, and sometimes that means I need to use less strokes, but I really want to try to do it, and there's this fight. I totally get that struggle. Yes, a large brush will help you. And the more you kind of get used to paint and consistency, the more you sort of, like what we were talking about before, just becoming aware, more and more aware of it. And awareness is not easy. And being unaware is also not shameful. It's just, we're always playing this, I'm aware, but I'm less able to do things. And then, so once you become aware, you can start working on being able to do. And then you kind of plateau for a while. This is like kind of skill, how skill works. And then you sit here and you're pushing. It's really hard to move above your awareness. And then your awareness jumps again. And you realize, oh, I'm rubbish at what I'm doing. And then you kind of climb that ladder and you start pushing and you realize that you're not making any progress. This is how it goes, right? So if you are becoming more aware now, that's a good thing, even if it's frustrating. So let's talk about ghosting. Back to ghosting. Ghosting is this thing, and again, this is so hard to get into your head. I remember the struggle. Is when we've painted something down. So let's go with this. We first put down this sort of darker purple. It came across, and you can see it down there. And we put that down first, and we said, okay, we need to be lighter, which is wonderful, right? Sort of realizing the new relationship of things as you're putting everything down. And so then we come with our paintbrush and we put it in, and we start to pull it in, and we get this ghost image just on the edges of everything, where you've got just these edges that don't quite line up. And I think this is something. There's a demonstration for kind of how this works, which is a really good thing to learn when you're using. This is why I use a pen when I'm drawing most of the time. Not when I'm drawing before a painting, but just when I'm sketching, because it forces you into some really good practices. And one of them is like this. So if I do this, and I kind of miss something over here, and then I come back, I'm trying to fix it, and I don't quite get it right, so I do like, okay, there we go, got it right. And in the end, unfortunately, what I've done is draw attention to the mistake that I made, right? Because this edge has more contrast, there's more to it, there's more stuff going on. I become aware of something that I'm really not trying to communicate. I don't want to communicate that. And so, just as a side note, using a pen really helps solidify this, because it's such a habit to go in and try and fix all the things you're doing. And so that brings back around to these edges, right? So coming in and putting a second layer on top, it's something everyone does. And this ghosting issue is also a problem that basically everybody has. No shame to it. And what it does is it draws our attention. It draws our attention to this area, to this thing that's going on. And you're kind of like, well, what's going on there? Or come across here, and it makes it act like a piece of detail, something that you want to see. It's small. It's got sharp edges. And certainly I'm not picking on you, because like I said, this is something everyone struggles with, because it's not something we sort of become aware of. Yep, everyone's relating. Fantastic. There you go. Everyone is relating. We all know. Okay. So let's see. I'm gonna show this in a couple of different pieces just to make sure that I'm if it's particularly relevant to you, that I'm bringing it up so that you're aware of it. So we've got on here. I've got Brie. Let's have a look in here. see what we can find. Yeah, so down here, right down here, right? So we've got that first sort of red layer that went down, and then we got this that came on top, and this that comes across here. We have ghosting in a number of fashions here. The first is that we can start to see this red in here. So it draws our attention because it's acting like a detail. The second is this line here, whether that was a sort of a previous attempt, and then we did a second that wasn't quite as opaque, or something going on. And oh, you know what? It might be water. That might be water streaking up. Yeah. So you know, it's just this thing. It's just this thing that happens that over here, right? So we've got this little part of the layer underneath, and then we've got the layer on top. So anytime two objects meet, or we're putting a layer over the top and it's going around, we really just have to sort of be aware that we're really starting to treat it, because otherwise it's communicating information that we never quite intended to communicate. Okay, let's keep going. Who else? John. Here we go. By the way, I've done this by topic. I'm really hoping that I've been able to communicate about everyone's work who is submitted. If I kind of miss something somewhere along the lines, let me know. I'll be able to give you some good personal feedback as well. It's definitely my intention to try and get to everyone and talk about everything. So okay, here we go. Back to this ghosting issue, which hopefully you guys are seeing how prevalent this is, and how we are playing Spot the Ghost. Yeah, I love it. Oh, Sage and Shadow. Oh my God, I just joined and I feel attacked. I hope you don't. I can't tell you what you feel. I'm sorry if that makes you feel like you're attacked. But we all love each other and respect each other, so. Kimberly says, the worst thing is I knew some of these mistakes. I had a long day of working on college assignments and I wasn't up to my usual level of paying attention to these little errors. Oh, Emma says, I'm late, I'm gonna apologize. Oh, funny attack. Okay, good. Well, good. Emma, it's okay. It's okay. If you miss something, you can go back and watch it. We're all good. Yeah, so, okay, we've got this here. So, again, this is, I'm presuming we've got the vase down, and then we put that second layer on top, and you know we've got that little ghosting going on, and it just brings our attention. Like, trying to think about this is like, all art is communication, and especially all variations in value show us a variation normally in form. And so when we have these unintentional variations in value, the brain's trying to interpret what this means. Does this mean that the vase sort of goes around and then sort of nicks back a little bit? Or is there a difference in sort of that primary color? Is there like a mark on it? And so it's just a matter of being like, okay, this is valuable, not just because it's nitpicky or it's the right thing to do, but because it's communicating something, as well as bringing attention, extra attention, just like that circle we drew. So yeah, so coming back and just, you know, seeing this ghosting all around, but because it's not something people talk about, so it's kind of hard to see. But this will improve the quality of your paintings, I promise. Kate, all right, there you are. Coming in. Okay, so there's some ghosting still up here. We've kind of talked about this stuff. You guys know what it's about. There's a little line in there that's not really too bad. But I think now that we've talked about ghosting, there are some other things to be aware of. Other things that are just as prevalent are maybe a little less attention getting than that pure ghosting. And also super understandable because it's a little more difficult. What I'm talking about is that when you have these objects and you're painting these objects and they're different values, they're different colors, you're coming in at different times to try and make them connect. And you're trying to leave space. You're trying to make it work so you're not distracting or destroying yourself. You kind of get these little edges here. You see, it's kind of where you put down a stroke and it comes across here. It comes across, and then you're lifting the brush, just like you should lift the brush, right? But what happens is that let's get this other. Here we go. What happens is that there you are. You come across your brush, and then you lift up like this, and it does this little flick, where before you had a certain amount of pressure distributed over the whole brush, and now if you do this really hard, you kind of have all that pressure instead of on just that little part of the brush. It's now as it's leaving, just like on this. And so it's just a little flick. And a lot of that time, that little flick picks up paint. And so you end up with this whole stroke is good, and then you get to the end, it's like whoop, and it just picks it up. And a lot of the time that ends up with an object being surrounded by these little less consistent parts. And again, let me make sure that you guys can see this. Again, it's a problem because it's communicating something, right? It's difficult to get your head at first around this idea that there's a function behind everything. There's a function to value that describes form. And so we get to something like this, and you're like, well, is there a different lighting scenario? Is it moving in a way that is catching the light differently? And so your brain starts to try and make sense of it. And it doesn't necessarily always make sense. Okay, so that comes across in other ways. For example, we kind of have this here, where again that ghosting. Okay, yeah, you got it. You got it. Okay, and Lindley. But it says, that explains so much. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Okay, it says, I didn't even realize this was happening. I know. It's all about awareness. It's all about awareness. And no one blames you for not realizing it's happening. Let's have a look. Okay, yeah, so the one I was thinking about was this big line coming in, which may have been intentional or may have been a lower layer. I think it's the same color as this. So I'm going to go ahead and presume that this whole thing was covered in that and then made a little lighter with this. And then we skipped across that edge there. But again, just as I would say, oh, look. Amber says, I've never considered the flick, but it makes so much sense. Absolutely. Potter Freak says, so how would you correct this? I would correct it. Let's go back to Kate's, because that's the one we're talking about. I would correct this by, that's a really good point. I'm glad you asked that because I didn't mention it. So I have a couple of ways I can do this. I can do the flick, which puts a lot of pressure in this little mini zone, or I can have this and lift, the pull and lift, so that I'm not sort of going up. And it happens to varying degrees. And if that's not still working, then you go the other way around the object and then back in and across. You kind of play different ways. Different brushes will act in different ways. So you might try using a round brush to do it. It's gonna have slightly less version of this. So yeah, it's kind of about just that brush work. And feeling free to come back in and do a second layer once it's dry. You don't have to get it right at first. Would the flick sometimes flick the paint into like droplets? Yeah. Stuffed Tomato says, I usually have the opposite problem where it's darker at the end. Yeah, that can happen too. That normally happens when there's either already paint down and as you're coming across here, you're scooping it up, or let's go back to that camera view where you can see this. Or it's so hard to get this right because it's the opposite way, where instead of kind of really laying flat, what you're doing is you're laying it where you're kind of like that. So you can lay it flat or you can lay it like that. And if you've kind of got this, what I'd call like that flick position, but if you kind of got that, then you're essentially pushing like a wave of paint in front. And as you go, you kind of just keep pushing that wave, and then you come up, and if you're not flicking it or whatever, you can even flick that forward a little bit if there's that wave in front. And then you end up with a lot of paint there. So we all have like our own little habits about how we do things. And so we kind of have to just look and evaluate about what is actually happening, what problems am I facing? Because, you know, we're both using a brush, but coming up with the opposite problems. And just, you know, becoming aware of that, and then seeing, you know, how does the way that I'm painting actually affect what I'm doing? Okay, Kay says, I find that sometimes at the end of a stroke, I realize I have too much water and it pools there. Yeah, so I think that's a little bit what I was talking about. Is there a way to correct that, trying to blot some water out, other than not having too much water to begin with? Bree says, I usually try to gently lift the water into a different drier and clean brush. Yeah, that's definitely something that I do, use that second brush to come in. The other way to deal with that, and I think I did this in the video, but I didn't articulate it. I did it, if you go back and watch where I was doing the transparent pieces. What it was is that because I had a lot of water in there, look, even closer. There we go. I have such a difficult time with that. Is when you had a lot of water there, so it pulls up at the front, just like we were talking about, and then lifting it up, and there's that pool at the side there, and so you start your next stroke right there, and you go across, and then there's a pool over this side, and you start your next stroke right there, and you're continuing to move that. It doesn't need to be a problem if it's not drying there, and it's water and it moves, and so you can kind of have this big pool that you're kind of pushing around and managing. It's the same as when you do the gradients in watercolor, and you make sure that there's a pool at the bottom of your line, and there's a bead line of water that comes on the bottom, and it doesn't have to be a problem because you move that bead line, you just keep moving it, and so it doesn't have to be a problem, even though it can be. Emma says, that might be a brush issue, Kay, like my silver black velvets dump at the end of a stroke. Yeah, certainly some of the more natural head brushes will take a lot more water in. All right, cool. Ghosting. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this next one is a little less on topic, but that's okay. I wanted to talk about it. John, let's bring it up here. John, you did a really great job of finding consistency. You really did. So like we said, we got some ghosting stuff there, like little spots in between where we haven't connected, provide a lot of contrast, and so they gain a lot of attention. And painting's a lot about controlling attention. If you accidentally kind of bring up something that's got high contrast, then it'll take attention, but you know, in the middle of between the between the carpet and the thing is maybe not where you want that attention. So again, that's kind of part of the value of consistency. The value of, forgive the pun, it's a terrible joke. Anyway, yeah, so what I want to talk about is something that is off topic, but I think you'll benefit from it, is I'm kind of having a look at these lines that come in and seeing that I'm going to make a presumption here that we're using a lot of sort of small strokes to try and get those lines. And for the same reason that we were talking about before, it makes it feel like it's a detail. And so it takes our attention. You know, like we have this really big line going across, and then there's a little bump and these little bumps. And it takes attention, right? So like right here as well. And so then we're starting to interpret what's the function of that? Does this mean that the vase is doing this thing? And because it takes attention where we don't want attention, it ends up being something that we want to try and get rid of that. Plus it hinges the communication of the curve of it, right? And so what I'm going to suggest is I think it's probably just a mechanical habit that you're in. I would suggest, if you can, where you can, try to just, can I do this in one stroke? Boom, do it across. And do it in a fast stroke. So, you know, we have a bit of jitter kind of inherent in the way that we paint, or, you know, a hand, it's just going to move naturally. And so the slower I do it, the more of those little movements come in and start to move things. If we do it fast, I have the same amount of movements in this whole thing as I had in that little thing. It's a matter of time. And so that's my recommendation. How much of this can I do in a single stroke? And can I do it relatively quickly? And I think that's actually going to, it's going to help so much in a little bit clearer communication and making your stuff just feel a lot better. So I think that's going to be really good for you. Okay, Ashley Rose. Make sure that I actually drink. Here we go. So I think that same might be true here, Ashley, as I was talking about with John. But let's see, edge work. This is more about edge work and missing pieces. So yeah, I mean, I suppose we talked about this in ghosting as well, but I want to just sort of introduce you to some of these pieces down here that we haven't quite connected. We haven't quite connected the objects that we're doing. And so it is a matter of not being as consistent, but it's in between things. And again, this is a call for attention, right? So we have this dark green, and then we have this pure white. And so anything with high contrast demands high attention. And we want to reserve that high contrast and high attention to the main focal points. So something like this right here, a beautiful little place, really descriptive of some of our main objects. And we want to eliminate high contrast, high attention in places like this down here, where it's happening just unintentionally, just because the things don't quite meet. So I think getting your objects to meet is going to really help, really help. And oh yeah. So actually, this is the one I want to talk about with loading. Loading being where I've kind of got different things on the same brush. So this either happened in one of two ways. Make sure I'm not missing what you guys are saying. Yeah, it either happened in one of two ways. Either you had one brush that had multiple colors on it, right? So we've got this darker spot and the lighter spot, and brush it, and then you ended up with multiple colors, or putting one down and while it's still wet, trying to come in with another, and then those two things are separate values. Which, as I'm looking a little closely, down at areas like this, I can start to see the signs of putting a darker one down and then putting a lighter one down. So I'm going to presume that happened. You're welcome to tell me I'm wrong. Oh, Ashley says, that's where I had the loading problem. I was using too big a brush, I think. I'm going to hesitate. Oh, at connecting? No, I'm going to hesitate to say that you had too big of a brush. I think, and you may be talking about these areas here. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, so this is the either loading, or probably more likely you had one color and you came with another, and there's a little too much mixing involved when you bring that second one in. Again, it might not be a problem in a normal painting, but we're building awareness for consistency. And so I just wanted to point out, this is an area where some of that consistency got a little bit jarred. I do want to say this, the background, really nice consistency. Oh, even some of these highlights. So you probably noticed in a number of the pieces we've looked at so far, we've had putting that purple layer down and then putting the white layer down and doing that white layer a little more transparently. You've done a really good job of actually getting that second layer, that layer that's going on top, to be either as opaque or more opaque than the layer underneath, which is really helpful. Okay, and then here's the second one. The second one where probably the same deal, going wet into wet, but not wet into wet's a really great technique. But as we're looking at consistency, it's a little bit harder to get consistent because you start to have these two paints that are interacting with each other. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But yeah. Oh, Ashley says, nope, you're totally right. Yeah, small area. Okay, cool. So let's have a look. Here we go. Okay, yeah, so I just addressed that. I have another for bad total. So I think we did some wet. Yeah, kind of areas like this, which happened in two ways, I think. In two ways. In one way, when you did this dark layer, we had a lot of, I think it was wet and transparent, and so there ended up being kind of the paint and then the paint that's underneath kind of showing through. So I know it's difficult. It is difficult to make something wet and opaque, which is why you put a second layer on, which is great. The second layer is also relatively transparent, and so you can start to see the stuff that's underneath it too. And so I'd recommend for you really just try and delve into making things that are wet and opaque at the same time. Wet and opaque. It's not easy, but it looks like it's the place you need to be right now. So I can see it here as well, having that inconsistency there. Kimberly says everyone's pieces look great. I agree with that. It's hard to sit here and be pulling everything apart. I also want to say that this stuff is great. I've been really enjoying seeing it come up, and I'm impressed. I know some of you have been using gouache for next to no time, and they still look amazing. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so there's that. Let's see. I want to make sure. I feel like I missed. Who did I not talk about very much? Okay, this one. I don't know exactly how to pronounce your name. Chow? Seo? Okay, but let's have a look at this. Okay, so the carpet on the floor, the consistency of that is just like king. Until it had a little splash down the bottom. That happens. That happens. This one up here at the top, it got a little less consistent, but to be honest, that's really good for such a large space. I think again we got a little bit of kind of extra water in some places, but I'm gonna guess that was just an accident because of how well you've done some of this other stuff. Feel free to paint over the top, right? Like we can, it's not cheating to go over for a second round when we have stuff like that. You've done a really, really good job. There's a lot of good stuff. The second thing I want to talk about is it's a little less on topic, but it's kind of these edges. As a matter of just communicating well and making sure that, oh, it's like Zao, but that's me. I need to change my name in Discord. Should I just call you Emma or should I call you Zao? I'm happy to do either. That was like 3 layers and I run out of the paint the same color. I was afraid I'd make it stand out more if the green spot was a different value. Yeah, I totally get that. Didn't want to like ruin everything and have to paint all over again. Totally. Cool. Yeah, so these edges, I think this is what you need to be aware of. Emma is fine. Cool, I'll just call you Emma. The next thing you need to be aware of, I think your consistency, you got that good. You're kind of aware of that, and so that's really nice. So edge control. So we've got a little bit of ghosting up here. You can see up the top here. But just a little bit, actually, there's not a great deal of it. So, but the edges is where we kind of need to come in and stuff like this can be really nice in places. But when it's the only edge that we've basically treated this way, it really gets a lot of attention. Contrast gets attention, which a lot of the time we're talking about value, but also contrast in any regard. If there's something that's the only way that's being treated in a particular way, like this, a lot of this other stuff is brushing along the sides, and this is the only place that's then it garners a lot of our attention. I'm not entirely sure that it's that's kind of what you're going for. But even, yeah, some of these edges. So I think just being aware of what your edges are doing, and there's no exact right answer for everything, but I think it's just the question of, is this what I want? And is this communicating what I want it to? And then the second thing, okay, Emma's saying, yeah, that was the flick we were talking about earlier from my big brush. Gotcha. Yep. Cool. I get it. But yeah, so the other thing about edges that I think is, so coming down to this orange, we're talking about this with John a little bit, kind of having these smaller shapes in amongst that big shape you're trying to communicate. It kind of cuts into the effect of that shape, and yeah, trying to just be aware of what my edges are doing in terms of the way that you produce them and the quality of transition between a hot edge or a soft edge, and as well like the silhouette of it. And so in this case, the silhouette's kind of cutting into it, and you're just what exactly is that trying to communicate? So like with everything, realizing that painting is communicating changes the way we look at things in a positive way, and having that question of what is this edge communicating is a really good thing. So cool. I'm really happy with just the consistency you're getting with everything. And now, let's see, who else did I talk about very much? Xantar, cool. So, Xanta, with this, I think, let's have a look in here. So right here we've got a semi-transparent area where we can start to see the places where the brushstrokes are crossing over. So there's a couple of ways to deal with this. If we want to use more opaque paint, that's one option, right? So you can paint over the top. Or if this is the degree of transparency you want, which is very legitimate, you're more than welcome to have this degree of transparency. Then once you sort of do this and you realize, well, that's still present, feel free to kind of go the opposite way. See if you can try and remove some of that strokes, kind of by moving the paint around to just be a little more evenly spread. So that's a really good option. We have some ghosting here, like we were talking about earlier. This stuff here, down in here in the shadow and up here on the side, has that degree of painting wet into wet, and it's always a little more confusing painting wet into wet because it's wet and you don't know how it's going to dry. And so I would, you know, especially when you're painting wet into wet, I'm wondering if we painted once and then did a little transparent layer over the top. I think that's, yeah, as I'm looking at that, I think I'm seeing a fair bit of that. That's a very valid way of doing things. That is a very valid way of doing things. But if we're trying to fix the stuff that's underneath, we want to come in with something that's more opaque than what's underneath. I think that'll help. That sort of trying to do that will help. As well as, and I think this might be right as well as waiting for it to dry. I would definitely feel free to give yourself a little more space, a little more room, by letting it dry and coming back in afterwards. I think that would be really good. So yeah, okay, here's where we had a lot of loading, I think. Instead of one stroke with different, but that may have been intentional. Yeah, what I'd really focus on for you is try to get, if you're going to do layering, then, which is very reasonable, perfectly good technique to have, then do your lighter washes first and build up in opacity. That actually get really, really good looks that way. And you can have more opaque underneath than transparent on top, but it's a little difficult. And we will be talking about that in a later lesson. And then just being aware of these edges. Definitely, if you can get those two things down, then that'll be awesome. Zelda main. Okay, Zelda, really cool. You got some really nice opaque spots, like this stuff here. That light and the light on the orange and this purple that you put up here are really super consistent. This stuff here that we put down as more of a wash, and down here are less consistent. You know, it's harder to have consistency in washes. I think some of that is, some of it happens in the in the cold press paper that you're using. You can see these little bits of pooling in, and so I'm going to ignore that as a problem because it's just what your paper is going to do. But I can also see a lot of these brush strokes which again, in a good painting, that can be really, really good, but I want you to have control of it so that you can make it more just doing what you want it to do. And so that can involve probably making the pass. And again, this is about awareness. So what I want you to do is, even if it's not working on a particular skill, it's stopping and saying, yeah, like, you did really good work in this painting. This is a good painting. But where are the spots where I'm communicating a shift in value by having a different degree of intensity to the paint, but it's not necessarily happening or communicating something, a shift in the form of the table. And so you get like light parts here and darker parts here. Experiment, just play with these washes, play with them, bring it out, paint it, and let it dry and see it and assess it, and write down what you're trying to do as well while you're doing these, because you have opaque down when you're going for consistency. The next step is just this transparency. One thing to do is, I'm not sure if you did this or not, putting the surface area that you're painting on a tilt, so you kind of always have this direction. And that would actually help with these brush strokes that are going sideways. If this whole thing was up, then you do this and the more intense part of this brush stroke starts to come down. And I'm wondering if a little more water would help this. Try it out. Try it out and see. Here we go. Old oak. My suggestion for you, old oak, is more paint. More paint. First of all, just mixing more paint, and let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, Cameron. Okay, yeah. Cameron Mitchell says paint was dry and just wouldn't reconstitute. So we'll come back over here. I get that. You might need to be pretty aggressive with how much water you're putting into this paint to reconstitute it. Yeah. Or, sorry, old oak. Are you, Cameron? Sorry, using pseudonyms. I kind of get a little messed up here. Yeah. Okay. So one is mixing a little bit more. So we can see it up here and down the bottom. Is what I'm presuming is there's inconsistency, but it's inconsistent inconsistencies, right? So I can see this stuff off on the side here. Like, this is really nice. This is good. This stuff you got down really. Oh, Cameron, you're Zelda main. Cool. Do you have any other questions, Cameron? I kind of want to make sure that I'm communicating well with you. Yeah, I want to make sure that. So feel free to ask any questions. Okay, Emma says, I was really surprised by how much paint I used on my piece. We used to watercolor, which goes forever, but gee, my tubes went down by a third at least. Really? I don't know what I told you before. Maybe try a little less. John said, same here. Interesting. Feel free to paint a bit smaller if you need to. Or, let's see. Yeah, okay. I've used these, probably used about a third of mine. It's okay, because from here on out, we're not really going for that really thick paint look all the time. John said I had to buy more. Yeah. Gives me an excuse to buy gouache, so I hear that. Okay, old oak. Mix more paint. The areas that you that you started with, I'm gonna presume you started on the edges here because they're thick. They are good. The different values in them are very slight, so it's really solid. And as we get here, we start to, I think, just kind of like lose as much paint as we were using. And so it's a matter of mixing more, I think. Then we get up to the top here. And we get into this blue, which I'm going to guess that this blue was a little harder in terms of opacity. A lot of this kind of Prussian blue ends up being relatively transparent. So you're using something that's at least akin to Prussian blue, and it's more transparent than other things. So and you'll find this is that we're using one color of paint, and we've like just figured out the perfect amount of water and the perfect amount of everything to deal with its degree of transparency. And then we get to Prussian blue or a lemon yellow, and that thing just betrayed us because it just doesn't act in the way the other ones act. Or like a phthalo green. Man, that kills it too. Which is why I suggest get to know a small amount of paints and then slowly expand. So you can start to not be surprised when something just destroys you. Okay, and so there's a couple of ways to do that, to deal with this. One is just second layer. Second layer would go pretty far, I think. The other is adding different paints, which can be frustrating if you want that purity of color. If you don't care about the purity of color, if you're just trying to get the right value, then you can add a bit of black and a bit of white and bring it back to where it was, and it'll be like super opaque, but it's also not going to be as intense. So it's a trade-off. What's most important to you with the color that you're using? Some other things is you could put a gray layer down. That's this value. Put that down first, and then do a wash of the color over top. They all have their trade-offs. Okay, so we have some ghosting here. You can see it across here. We have some second layer things that we talked about. And we talked about a lot of this, so I'm not going to go into depth because hopefully just listening, you know what I'm talking about. We also have some second layer stuff here where the second layer is, again, not as, it's a little transparent. And so and probably what happens here, I can see this as well, is that you put the second paint down and end up lifting some of the layer of the first paint. It sucks. Always happens. It doesn't always happen. It's better when you leave things to dry entirely. It's a lot easier. And when your second layer is thick enough, then this doesn't happen. Also, just analyzing how much pressure am I putting on different parts of my brush can definitely get in the way. Really good control of these edges. Fantastic. You're not leaving anything there. So super, super cool. Let's see, mixing enough paint and making and getting used to painting on top. We will talk more about that. But I can see some really good solid areas. So I think you have the understanding of this down when we're not dealing with the secondary things of, second layers of one color on top of another. So that's super cool. And then we've got Nicole. So I think we already talked about this. So I think we've talked to everyone, which is really cool. So we've got that. There's a couple of things, a couple of questions. And I think I might have to do this in another video because it's been an hour and a half and my throat is getting a bit sore. So I'm going to add a secondary video at a later point where I can speak properly, just addressing some of the questions. And the questions are, just so that you guys know. So we talked, and I can talk to this one real quick. We talked about sometimes having the brush soak up a whole bunch of paint. Like you mix your paint and then you put your brush down, and it just like the paint is gone. Which I totally get used to. I understand. The answer to that, at least in part, is to soak your brushes beforehand. And it doesn't have to be like super extensive. It doesn't have to be a whole bunch. But if they are wet, just wet enough, like you can, sorry, you don't actually see this. You can brush out a lot of the main parts of the water, but if there's already a degree of water being held by the brushes, then your brushes aren't going to soak up more water. There's not space for them to do that. Since it's going to be a balance. You want to not have so much water in your brushes that you put it down and it just vomits water everywhere and suddenly the thing you were doing is ruined. But you want to have enough that it's not pulling up the water, essentially, or the paint as you do that. So that is definitely a thing. We're going to talk about some recipes for gouache. Today says, you also have a live video tomorrow, right? I do. The Etcher event. So you guys are welcome to come and have a look. I think it's midday Eastern Daylight Time on Etcher's channel. Yeah, so we can talk about color temperature when mixing different colors. That's actually quite a large conversation. So that's why I'm going to do this in a separate video. And then recipes for water. Having more of a helping you guys to see how much paint and how much water and what kind of effect that has. Having a very good visual for that. And maybe something a little more like a recipe. So we'll talk about that later. But yeah, thanks guys for being here. Bree says the Etcher event's at the same time as the first Lightbox Expo gouache demo. Time to learn to watch 2 gouache videos at once. Oh no. It's right, you can watch back. But yeah, okay. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope that helps. I hope that helps even if I wasn't able to talk to your paintings specifically for everyone who is just auditing. And again, if I skipped out on anyone, I'm sorry. I'm definitely trying to get to everyone and it was an accident. So let me know and I will come and we'll chat. It'll be good. But you guys are great and I can't wait to see what you guys do for the next week. See ya.